Brazil's importance on the world stage is such that President Obama hailed it as an equal partner. As the Brazilian leader makes her first official visit to Washington, we ask if the US is giving the emerging power the recognition it's seeking. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff represents the world's sixth largest economy and an emerging global power. On Monday, she met with President Obama at the White House, but she's not receiving a state visit to Washington. Privately, officials in Brasilia are said to feel snubbed. It's not that relations are bad between the two nations, far from it, but its growing power on the world stage has at times left the US uncertain over whether Brazil will use its growing diplomatic clout to fully support Washington's geopolitical priorities. In 2010, the then President Lula da Silva, along with Turkey, attempted to forge an independent civilian nuclear deal with Iran. And last year, Brazil backed Palestinian statehood. Just two examples of Brazil diverging with US policy. But there is much they do agree on. As South America's fastest growing economy, Brazil's new middle class is an important market for US exports. At the same time, Brazil hopes to bolster its sales of aircraft and weaponry to the US. Brazil and the US are the top two ethanol producers in the world, and the two nations are joining forces to advance research on biofuels. Then there's the development of deep water oil drilling, another joint undertaking. The last and perhaps most important issue for Brazil, though, is to garner American support to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. However, it's thought that support is unlikely to be forthcoming anytime soon. So, how is the relationship between the two most dominant powers in the Americas evolving? To discuss this, we're joined by Paulo Sotero, the director of the Brazil Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center, a think tank here in Washington. In New York, we're joined by Paulo Vieira da Cunha, a consultant to the IMF and former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Brazil. And also here in the studio, Peter Hakim from the Inter-American Dialogue, a center for policy analysis, also based here in Washington, D.C. Paulo Sotero, then, much is said about the relationship between the US and Brazil, the equal partnership and so forth, and yet this isn't a state visit. How important do you think that is? Should people in Brasilia still feel slighted by that?
I don't think so, frankly. I think that this is a relationship that suffered a major setback in 2010 around the Iranian episode, and that is in the rebuilding phase since the visit last year by President Obama to Brazil. This is now, today, President Dilma Rousseff reciprocated, and I think this is, a mature relationship with much promise, always with much promise. It's up to leaders, to business community, to engage and to deepen this relationship.
Peter Hakim, you guffawed at one point though. Should we read much into the fact that this isn't a state visit? David Cameron got a state visit, the Indians got a state visit, but Brazil hasn't.
I don't think the issue is the state visit so much. I think the question is, what are they going to talk about? What are the results going to be?
But is it symbolic of the fragile nature of the relationship?
It's somewhat symbolic, the fact that there are four countries that got state visits this year, and they are China, India, Great Britain, and Mexico. And Brazil should be in that category. At least the Brazilians think they should be in that category, and they probably should.
Paulo Vieira da Cunha, we'll go into that Iranian issue perhaps a little later on in more detail, but is it simply because of that issue that do you think that Brazil didn't manage to get a state visit, or are there other outstanding issues on trade and economics and other geopolitical issues that are also coming to the fore there in that decision?
Well, I must tell you that I really didn't know the difference between the state visit and the non-state visit. I personally don't think it's much of an issue, and unless the press makes out of it, I don't think in Brazil it's much of an issue. The reality is that the relationship is built around many points. On the economic issues, the relationship hasn't moved forward in a very long time, although these issues have been debated at least for the last 20 years quite intensively. But perhaps the most important thing, which is the bilateral tax agreement, is nowhere near completion, although if you talk to the people involved, they say it's almost near completion. But my view, and that would be a huge plus, but I don't think we are very close to it.
As far as what might be achieved on this visit, certainly the Brazilian authorities are emphasizing the issue of education, Paulo Sotero. How important is that?
Yes.
What might be achieved on that?
This is very important for one reason. It's very clear in Brazil. For Brazil to achieve more, grow better, with higher quality, Brazil needs to confront certain deficits we have. Education is one of them, science, technology, innovation. And Dilma Rousseff, who is much more of a domestic policy president than a foreign policy president compared to Lula or to Cardoso, has really focused on this, announced some very important program for promoting Brazilians studying abroad. Those are all very
Science
positive.
Without Borders, what does that mean?
Science Without Borders, 100,000 Brazilian university students going abroad, maybe 35 to 40% of them to the United States, and to build relationships that proved positive in the past. Some of the great centers of excellence in Brazil, centers that gave us Embraer, that helped to transform Brazilian agriculture, energy, they are products of those relationships that were built 40, 50 years ago. So I think the president is absolutely right to focus on that, because the problem now and the issue in Brazil, for Brazil to be a great power, Brazil has to be a great economic power and confront domestically certain bottlenecks we have.
As far as the economic relationship is concerned, Peter Hakim, though, are we expecting anything, perhaps, probably nothing on the taxation issue, for example, but what are the main issues to be discussed?
Well, I mean, in many respects, it's precisely the economic issues that are the most important for both countries. China may have taken the place of the United States as Brazil's leading trade partner, but trade is booming between the two countries. Over the past 10 years, it's almost doubled, or maybe even more than doubled. And Brazil is becoming a larger and larger market for U.S. goods.
Actually, we have some marvelous statistics which we can employ at this point,
But,
conveniently enough. The U.S. remains one of Brazil's major trading partners, but China also has a growing importance for Brazil. Here are some of those figures. Over the past decade or so, the value of trade between Brazil and the U.S. has steadily risen from $30 billion a year to nearly $60 billion. Brazil's trade with China has increased at a much larger rate, though, over the same period, from just $3 billion in 2001 to $56 billion in 2010. And if you include the $30 billion that China has invested in Brazil, China now has a higher stake in the Brazilian economy than the US. Meanwhile, Brazil's economy itself has grown year by year over the last decade, outperforming many developed nations. The figures show a steady increase in individual purchasing power. In 1999, Brazilians had a disposable income of just over $6,000. That had risen to almost $11,000 by 2010. Sorry, Peter, I sort of interrupted you rudely.
Well, I mean, you've laid out why Brazil is so important for the United States, and the United States is as important for Brazil, if not more so. It has an economy that's some 5 times larger than Brazil's, major source of capital, technology, also a major sort of buyer of Brazilian products, particularly manufactured goods. But Brazil and the United States haven't advanced their trade agenda very much. They're trading more, but that's largely
so what
due to
specific
business.
issues there?
Well, just to take one example, there's 11 countries with which the United States has signed free trade agreements in the Americas. The United States and Brazil can't find enough common ground to even begin negotiating a free trade agreement. The U.S. and Brazil have signed virtually no trade agreements. They have not worked together very effectively in the international forum, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and other forums on trade and investment. So it's really a shame, because I think that relationship could be a lot more productive. It's a little bit empty now.
But Paulo Vieira de Cunha, of course, in the media we're often accused of looking for binary oppositions and so forth. But is there any sense of China's gain being America's loss in this relationship, or is that stretching it? I mean, does China's closeness to Brazil necessarily mean that the U.S.'s relationship with Brazil is suffering in any way?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily one in opposition of the other, but the reality is that it has been. There has been a great deal of interest in Brazil to foster this relationship with China, because China is, of course, one of the biggest buyers, the largest buyers of some of Brazil's crucial exports. Brazil is, concentrated into 4 commodities, the main exports, and of these 4 commodities, with the exception of sugar, China is really the largest buyer. So the economic reality is that Brazil has to foster a deeper relationship with China, and one that becomes more bilateral. On the other hand, the relationship with the United States, stretches back for a much, much longer period of time. And I would say that if you look in terms of the patterns of the economy, what is surprising is that there are a lot more similarities with the United States. In fact, the Brazilian consumer, by many people, is thought to be perhaps one of the closest cousins to the American consumer. There are very few other countries in the world where people are so willing to get into debt and to spend so much effort and such a large proportion of their income into consumption as in Brazil. Just like the United States, Brazil has a very low savings rate and has a fairly dynamic private sector with considerable amount of entrepreneurship. So, I mean, there are a lot more similarities in addition to the history and, of course, the important history of fostering institutions, including the educational ones that Paulo mentioned, that tie the United States to Brazil. But it is a very unequal relationship, and the shadows of the past are still present much more in the Brazil-U.S. relationship
Which shadows
than in the Brazil-China. I mean, if you go back to the personal history of President Dilma, there's by now, it's quite well known that in the 64, the whole uprisal and the rise of the military regime had the connivance of the United States, if not the direct support. And in certain parts of those operations that the military set into motion in 1964-65, stretching to 67, it was very, very clear the direct participation of American institutions. And this was part of a wider process going on in Latin America at that time. And the history of sort of anti-American feeling and the political mobilization around that kind of agenda has been there in Brazil, I would say, for the last 50 years or so. It was much more intense up until the 1970s, 1980s than it is today. So today I think we are living a good moment, and where I think this relationship can be seen much more of one of equal to another, and with mutual interests, and hopefully we will get something more out of it.
And that's certainly what President Obama is keen to emphasize. When President Obama visited Brazil 3 months after Dilma Rousseff's inauguration, he emphasized those sorts of themes. Let's hear what he had to say, actually.
I'm here to tell you that the American people don't just recognize Brazil's success, we root for Brazil's success. As you confront the many challenges you still face at home as well as abroad, let us stand together. Not as senior and junior partners, but as equal partners, joined in a spirit of mutual interest and mutual respect, committed to the progress that I know that we can make together. I'm confident we can do it.
Paulo Sotero, though, I mean, marvelous sentiments. And yet, when Brazil does strike out on its own, showing leadership in the international arena, there is this perception that the U.S. has an incredibly patronizing attitudes towards Brazil, because Brazil sometimes decides that the U.S. policy isn't perhaps what's best for Brazilian strategic interests or the strategic interests of the rest of the world.
Yeah, there is an expectation here in Washington being in good terms with the United States, means supporting the United States in everything the United States does. Doesn't work in Brazil, doesn't work in part, I would say, for ideological reasons, doesn't work because of reasons of interest. Why don't we have a trade agreement? Because we compete, and we have competed worldwide against one another, for instance, in agriculture. And the United States had pretty protectionist policies and still has pretty protectionist policies. And this is what, and then other difficulties unrelated to the United States, this has what prevented, for instance, the Doha deal. This is an obstacle to a deal between Brazil and the United States. Many in Brazil recognize probably it would be in the best interest of both countries right now. But in the question of recognition and leadership, I think the relationship has to mature some more. So one day the United States will understand that having good relations with Brazil doesn't mean that Brazil will support the United States every time the United States wants to be supported.
So clearly, Peter Hakim, the big example of the problems of Brazil as an emerging geopolitical power was this Iranian fuel swap deal in 2010, under which Brazil and Turkey negotiated with Iran. They would send half of their low-enriched uranium to Turkey. In return, they'd get high-enriched uranium for their medical reactors. It was a deal which the Brazilians said was actually actively encouraged by the US until it actually succeeded. And then the US, and indeed the US media, pretended that Brazil had gotten, out on a limb by itself and negotiated this, when subsequently, members of Lula's government presented letters just from a week prior to the agreement being reached, saying, with President Obama encouraging that deal, saying that this would be a major step forward. What on earth?
And you
what
could
exactly
even go further. A group of very prominent American diplomats, after the deal was signed, and the U.S. Got very angry at Brazil that the U.S. should have dealt with this very differently and that it could have advanced.
What happened?
Well, I think what happened was, first, there's a lot of miscommunication. The Brazilians tended to celebrate much too quickly. They sort of saw this as something that they had achieved.
But they had achieved it.
Well, but the point is that diplomacy is discretion also. And the point was that the U.S. had asked them not to do this.
Not to do what? I mean, again, there's a paper trail suggesting there was encouragement for a fuel swap deal.
They actually sent a letter encouraging them. There's no question. But months before the actual negotiations took place, the U.S. was backing away from that and communicated amply with Brazil. Brazil chose to disregard that second, and the U.S. probably was wrong. I mean, there was just sort of mistakes.
But wasn't Brazil by that point acting as a major geopolitical actor, not simply doing the bidding of the U.S.? Weren't they perfectly in their right to do that?
Well, they're totally in their right to do so. Let me just. There's no question that Brazil had every right to. The question whether it was advancing toward a deal whereby the U.S. and Iran and the members of the Permanent Council of the United Nations could find an agreement that would make clear to everybody that Iran wasn't developing nuclear power. That's the issue. Not who was right or wrong, but to what extent does it succeed in sort of addressing a problem.
Right. But what do we learn from that?
One criticism in Brazil, it was very present, this was much debated in Brazil, and I think a fair conclusion was that there was a certain amount of overreaching on the part of Brazil, and this is proven by the fact by two BRIC countries, Russia and China, that Brazil was counting would abstain from supporting sanctions, finally ended up supporting.
But after a very long process, they're not really connected to...
In Brazil, though, it's interesting that President Dilma Rousseff understood what this had done to a very important relationship and decided to invest in rebuilding this relationship. One of her first acts in Congress, at the presidency, was to separate Brazil from endorsing certain practices in the United States, in Iran, like stoning, and trying
human rights agenda,
trying to make an effort there. I believe, therefore, the issue is still there. Iran is apparently back on the table. Will go back to the table, negotiating table. Let's hope that this time they will reach an understanding. But what Brazil was attempting to do in 2010 is precisely what the countries the P5 plus Germany are attempting to do now, and let's hope they succeed.
Paulo Vieira de Cunha, though, I mean, where does all this leave Brazil's attempt to get a permanent seat on the UN Security Council then?
Well, I don't think it leads necessarily closer. I think the issue of the UN Security Council, as the issue of representation in the IMF and so many other things, has to do not only with Brazil, but with a whole broader reorganization of power, which includes the China primarily, if you look at the Bretton Woods organization, but it also includes India and certainly aspirations of many others. And so that is the issue.
But that's what's so interesting.
It's totally ridiculous that Brazil has the same share as Belgium in the IMF, but the fact is that you have to negotiate that with Europe as a whole and with the other bloc.
But I mean, this then comes down to the Obama administration's policy towards Brazil, Latin America, and the BRICS. The Obama administration does support India's permanent membership of the Security Council. You sometimes wonder whether that's simply a kind of divide and rule attitude. They don't really have much creativity, sometimes you think. They haven't perhaps adapted to a rising Latin America, which isn't simply you're either with us or against us, but forging its own relationships, and with the BRIC nations themselves. It's a whole different animal, which perhaps the Washington hasn't necessarily come to terms with, Peter Hakim.
Well, I think this is a real sort of mystery for me about U.S. diplomacy. Why the U.S. should seem to lean so far in the direction of India at this point, when on most of these issues, even where the U.S. and Brazil disagree, and there are a whole slew of issues on which they disagree, that Brazil has a better profile, whether nuclear, non-proliferation, whether relations with Iran, name it, sort of that peace in general, democratic, and somehow the U.S. consistently rewards India and keeps Brazil at a distance.
Any insights? I mean, what's going on?
That if it's not, that is not resolved, especially at this moment when the United States is facing so many difficult issues and is in a period of relative decline in its world position. I think if this is not resolved in the next year through dialogue, recognizing that Brazil as a democracy is indeed a country that is entitled to more space in the world, I think you could have in Brazilian society a sentiment rising that Brazil really fears, the United States really fears for some strange reasons Brazil's rise, which contradicts what is the stated position of the Obama administration, that Brazil's rise is in the interest of the United States because Brazil only rises as a democracy.
Is it not connected, though, perhaps to the Obama administration's general lack of direction as far as Latin America as a whole is concerned? I mean, arguably you could say that they haven't really dealt with the changes across Latin America, that the more left-leaning governments, Colombia and Brazil becoming close friends, and all these. I mean, there's so many different things going on, which the U.S. somehow, is it unfair, Paulo Vieira de Cunha, to feel that the Obama administration always seems to be a step behind all these developments?
Well, I think so. I think that, but that's again a charge that has been leveled so many times about U.S.-Latin American relationships. The fact is that you have a special relationship with Mexico because of the border. That consumes a lot of the U.S. attention. And then occasionally, you have these inroads in other areas. My sense is that it's neither more nor less than it has been. But the real challenge is that Brazil is becoming a much more important, is in fact already a regional power. And it is a secondary pole, none to other than the United States. And as Brazil begins to have these deeper economic relationships with the neighboring countries, which is something relatively new in Brazil's history, it changes the way that the United States does its diplomatic and political relationships with Latin America.
We have 20 seconds.
I think the United States should welcome this because it has so many other issues to deal with, that having an ally of the quality that Brazil is and could even become more would be in the interests of the United States to sort of have that.
We really only have 10 seconds left. Paulo Sotero, very quickly, a last word there. Is Brazil, though, without that Lula ideological sense of a global place for Brazil, with Dilma, is Brazil really a voice for the global South, or is it a much lesser? Is there much less of an idealistic view of Brazil's leadership? Is it more of a leader for its own corporations, actually, in the region, rather than
I think it's a leader for its own interest at this point. President Dilma Rousseff is much more focused, as I said, in on domestic issues, because she understands for Brazil really to rise, it has to rise as a growing economy, as a country that treats its citizens well. And I think in that regard, we are doing well.
Paulo Sotero, thank you very much. Paulo Vieira de Cunha in New York, thank you. Peter Hakim, thanks as ever as well. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the programme. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.